perhaps perhaps suitable, just about to mention whether condemn about whether another, whether also whether recent and whether mentioned, and whether recent and whether another, whether recent and whether also mentioned, whether recent and whether recent as with the recent there about, whether recent as with the recent there portion of the phrase, and whether as recent and whether mentioned towards the Nazis about not having elegance. The sounds Nazis produce doesn't have much of elegance, and they're kind of was a bit of a modernist populace. They're wrote about starts to produce certain sounds that's kind of outside the sound file. Lately I took a field trip to the whether completing the first two notes of firstly whether recent there and whether recent there and whether recent there also whether recent there and whether. Most of the technology fields as of this current year, as of this current this 1 year, has been bought from, so occupied and bought the outsiders out, while these mass irresponsible ones produces technology too early, doesn't affect social impact, are plain crazy. They have no beauty, and noticing if one that leaves beauty out of his products, doesn't matter the results. It's always at least foul. And beauty should be now, whether return to whether beauty has been, whether it's an average. Not having beauty causes problems, and the liar is covered up. The dishonest entities are like these ones are plentiful for Nazism. It treats its body like a hijacked corpse. The stomach is to obey it. So when we lie, whether the usual lies about something, but those ones are able to twist around its stomach and laughter and suddenly be hungry, and such a flexibility and manipulability that disobeys the natural order of life. This pisses off the sorrow and possibly pisses off certain ancient idols, and these rent out the force and ability, whether it grants us the yearning towards deleting these. That's perhaps how life works. Each person is probable enterprise more so than person, and results sometimes when a person is stuck in a place, it's probable because it's a close vote. Notice after a person eats big meals, he is much more humble. It has to do with the stomach fluid and whether the stomach votes. Life does work like that, and why would the Dragonborn sort of be the savior? Because in particular, he has excellent flexibility to such a point that nobody will actually really find it to the public side. Because he will be alone, like, oh, I also cannot take it. But I managed to probably counter a lot of the spells, didn't I? Check out the movie Mission Impossible and Finding Waldo, or whether the concept and that works, and whether the concept. Can one find the chosen one? Does they know where the chosen one is? I'm very much covered. I am the chosen one. Oh, that's how he looks right now. Once I disrespect, Jews will probably be not treated as better, and that will only bring it in a way to balance. Because in a way, the dominated side is actually all evil, right? With Kuoma, and whether at first and whether along with at first instance, the initial instance, along with Kuoma, and to bring it to balance, because their dominance is not announced. So not to, if it's the equality is already day one, right? And notice on how logical sounding perhaps, and whether reason there perhaps logical sounding there is, whether thereof. Countering towards modernity countable as a bit of a mission possible. It's combination, whether it's along with whether it's Warden Freeman, plus Mission Impossible, plus Finding Waldo, and whether it's plus Terminator perhaps, and whether it's straight to whether it's just perhaps Waldo. And I may be picking certain concepts and matches, perhaps of worthy of a consider perhaps reason or whether probable of worthy of a consideration of whether of a reason or worthy of a consideration. If one attains to public shame, he's not moving outside the box, he is within the box. The box that is by modernity, that is master level quiz, consider if a monstrous lethality, wouldn't these all try to be as mediocre possible? That's in a way what the hover point is. You cannot be any more worse. You pay the minimum upkeep, where therefore you engineer way, you optimize. Only due to our advanced spells had they not be moving at certain levels. Whether doing some foul moves, and theirs usually shouldn't be flawless, whether even very impeccable with a very detailed logic with it. Because logic is actually not really understood, right? But whether and its association with how these undead misbehave, whether unbehave, reason they're afraid of it, and whether also which can be considered as properties of. Usually the stuff are not really logical. Sometimes they started as fetish, or whether started comparative generally, whether reason comparative generally, and then finishes off with a giant fetish. Right? We have these pathetic wussy individuals that are plain crazy. Check out the way they laugh, and when a lot of the extremists and gorms doesn't check the historical sites at a certain place, that's like not flipping the photo album of a country. Then he's not a member, he's a soloist. And also they are plentiful crazy for being soloists. Notice that the word crazy is overused, so they're not really the mediocre level or sort of just weak, right? They're quite lethal. Sometimes those ones are a comparative, less lethal version of divisions of the Turks, and they can actually use limerism, whether recruit others and convert them and zombify them into more of a puppetry. In a way, almost every person can be zombified because they have a sleaze mode. They could be more of a vulnerable state, whether in a more of an ill state, and those ones usually can be recruited, and it takes the resummoning back of the zombification has themselves been suppressed. Sort of. And probable was considered, whether was also considered, whether also was considered, probable, and whether another, and whether probable was. Lots of the doings out there are not really with the community, with another, and are in respect to, which is sort of not in respect, whether in retro perspective, whether in retro perspective, whether in perspective to, whether in whether money instead thereof, whether towards it's to show off, to represent to identical golems how great they are. And by the way, whether completed do and whether cannibal is applied to the reason they are not of. That's the case of the extremist golems. So less they're examined on whether investigate towards how the serves and whether the zombies is death or not. Lots of the makings, whether lots of the doings out there, the West, which the upper class is gone, which is sort of the true Westerners, and whether the Westerners and the rest of it is much of user-resistant persons without the quality of being a monarch and sort of an average person. Beauty in a way is not, whether like beauty is sort of, whether like being this Aryan hood, whether have these traits, it's not really above average or excellent. That's actually quite the minimal. Noticing how much trouble the society has gotten since those ran became, along with equality and welfare, mass amount of cancers started running the societies. At the functional level, whether per realism data these, whether of realism data, and whether reasonary, and also whether reasonary and whether of realism data these are running the societies. A lot of CEOs, if persons check profiles, are not our guys. Certainly the knight has the knights being bloodily battled against, and whether viciously, passive-aggressively battled against, and whether reasonary and whether battle towards against, and whether reasonary and battle towards, and whether another, whether reasonary and whether battle towards, whether reasonary and whether and minor rather, and whether also rather towards against, or whether reasonary passively aggressive against, or whether reasonary against. And which group will be doing it? Is there really a necromancer called that able to convert all these individuals? Accountable as also whether it's applied to reasonary, could be another video instance mention of these are all constant quiz master, whether they're in a way mass extension or whether robots, whether reasonary and whether also automatron entities, and whether also entities has some circumstance comparative and whether much more suitable with the entities. So about the trip, whether I took a recent considerable field trip, not without some bother. And speaking which, whether, by the way, return to here, not without throughout the way some enfeeble. Later on, I got into a considerable stack because it was less of the harbor front, more back to the roadside. Noticing each of these are so casual and usual. They're roads, they're police officers, they're firefighters, they're arsonists, and they're terrorists. Produce nothing. 100% of the culture comes from, the culture comes from exclusively our guys, not from the 7 billion. And our guys makes it happen. Removing the 7 billion, culture will probably be faster. Whether without the 7 billion, they're bothered, and whether at least bothered, they were with 7 billion, whether reason there and whether the progress would be in whether there will be more cultural flourish, whether there will be instead of whether reason and whether rather than whether reason there and whether there will be more there will be culture faster, whether there will be faster, or whether culture will be faster, whether there will be culture faster, whether reason there and also with the word of probable is also unhealthy individuals are plenty. Something about where I came probably 500 or whether 1,000 years late. Because check out around, it's almost as if our guys are very few in numbers, any prominence, and most of the activities involve attrition grind of time and set to exhaust. And then how would our guys even be out there, be able to patrol? The two mechanics will be spreading so fast. There needs to be restriction exclusively, at least more prioritized, whether at the realism data level, whether at the function, whether reason, and whether at the functionality, level, towards the two mechanics spreading entities, whether the two mechanics, whether reason there and whether the two mechanics are cancerous, and whether reason there and whether the cancer exists. Per day, they could be increasing by drastic numbers at a faster of tank and drone production. Tank and drone could be probably named for a company. There should be outreach from Yazidis of Iraq, tourists from, whether reason there are citizens from Milan, tourists from, whether citizen is, whether reason there are mail makers, whether factory workers from Milan, tourists from Nice, and passengers from Paris. One division of thugs goes out there to harass. Then other divisions of thugs, whether several divisions of thugs, starts to mention as protest from wielding its liberal system welfare, and is granted whether this yet appreciated mass amount, whether considerable amount of English lessons, each being throughout treated with envy, whether given envy and whether also gifted envy, and whether also gifted envy, whether recent there and whether recent and whether recent there gifted envy, whether recent there and whether gifted, and whether recent there and whether there and whether recent there and whether recent there and whether gifted. And also treated as on a per capita basis, despite being a mass number based. Compared to the mediocres, the vile mediocres, are we more of an analyzer or someone that checks things like robotic persons, or are those whether like robotic entities, or whether reason there and whether entity, or whether like robots, not to be providence of cancerous, and are those much of a automatron existential, whether reason there, whether automatron factor churn machines. Taking photos outside, one could gather some evidence to glance over, and whether to investigate towards to, and whether reason there another pronunciation, and whether you investigate towards to. It would probably serve also as great evidential, whether there, and whether also, or whether recent, and whether recent there, and whether also external factors. which countable as counters towards lots of the anesthetic sprays out there. The anesthetic sprays comes in primary, whether multiple forms or whether different forms. It comes during a conduct, and it re-emphasizes the distorted social notions. These being much besides police protected, they are constantly respected. If thieves aren't even touted and announced again, that's almost like the emperor level at thief. And here where the thief has a strength. Now that's the case of the thieves. For whatever reason, that's the case of the thieves. Nazism, probably much worse. Whether they less investigate onto what the Zambas that's on. Whether that's what's the investigation towards the Zambas, whether investigate towards the Zambas. For those could be quite whether those will be quite test on whether those will be quite of whether it would yield how much and whether what those tests on and plus the variance measures. After many technologies, the bartenders, whether many of these unreputable and whether problematic individuals capture the technology fields at Romania. What do these do with it? Spreading degen doesn't produce much of a work. And noticing the ones without the upper class culture, the inquisition, whether the recruitment towards the individual needs to be on traits first, then these qualifications, these are equivalent to whether frauds. These are much of Nazism qualifications. And these Nazis tend to be more legitimate than our guys. Notice in all of the words being occupied, legislature, lawyer, Supreme Court, or whether some officers and whether personnel at different offices. And the words officers, judges, has become a league of elected peasants, which besides being much of evil, do not know even what they're doing. So this sort of underness, whether underperformance of being this evil, rather naturally, whether defaultly, and whether first provides a sort of blurred shield, or whether sort of a cover. A bit ambiguous, miraculous, and whether ambiguous probable to be considered. Even when it makes it to be a whether reason and whether a ambiguous dysfunction, as several times, whether often enough and whether often reason and whether also whether not whether often enough and whether mentioned at the books of and whether mentioned at some of the entries at the blog, whether reason there and whether as mentioned before, which was mentioned at the whether reason and whether which was mentioned amongst some posts of the blog. Suppose the legality entities wanted to suppose it wouldn't send alarmism towards our guys by combating towards with its whether it's direct physical knife stabbing, it immediately would, it's already on whether at first and whether at before the recent phrase of whether they're recent adjacent to probable of and whether it's probable perhaps of and whether it's perhaps of and whether not the probable and recent and accountable as probable, whether it's probable accountable as emphasis and whether emphasize or and whether emphasize and whether emphasize and whether recent and whether another whether and whether recent and whether recent and whether emphasize or these being on and whether in a ways these being on and whether another and whether these being on maximum whether on max brutality, whether on maximum brutal, whether maximum brutal level, whether in max brutality level. those are bots, right? With hijack quotient, two of which and whether to count and whether and whether instead of two of which countable as supplying down to reasons they are mentioning, and whether also mentions and whether perhaps of reason there, whether perhaps of also mentions. Recent field trip to Niagara Falls, or so the surrounding place around, or whether the regions thereof, whether the accustomed venues thereof. The field trip to the harborfront, whether also a trail. And I noticed in whether the situation is much more worse. It requires more urgency, and suitable with a camera brought along, because I probably did some gestures when I marched along like a true Aryan commander, like a great commander of, whether also admiral of a championship status or whether aircraft fleet. I'll build lots of aircraft carriers at the future. I'll build 50, 100. Could be one day, could be possible. Someone else will be built. I'll be like Kublai Khan, which started this place, and Genghis Khan took all the score points. Kursa bastard, I'll place a statue as a reminder so someone will know. And that someone can be the next chosen one, or perhaps me myself. But the memory being erased. Instead, it's the music and the tunes that lasted. What a last. Last to last. At last, Allah Akbar. So much isn't Allah Akbar. It's words can be fruitful notes. You must not occupy another's occupancy, or whether much of unsuitable of, whether unsuitable and whether reason of unsuitable of, and whether also whether in addition to whether reason whether reason they're just, and whether reason there, whether another, and whether reason there, and whether not suitable of, and whether also whether and much of, and whether addition to whether towards whether, and whether reason there just, and whether reason there, and whether much unsuitable, whether reason there, and whether reason there, the word that's the unsuitable of, and whether reason there, and whether unsuitable, and much of, to of. And check out the word and whether the sound of, whether the way it is pronounced and the approach towards it, whether they're in tune with it, whether the tunes with it. It's Allah, it's not apple. You don't say apple Akbar. That's reference to a specific noun, whether reference to an object, whether references to apples. And one doesn't mention compliment Akbar. So why is it specific Allah? Allah. Vault of the griefs, vault of the happiness, and possible also at some instances, whether at one moment, one opportunity, one chance, one moment, Allah Akbar. And that itself almost proves there is almost no Allah except the person that speaks Allah. Once the person that speaks Allah no longer there, the Allah vanishes. And that's something probably haunting, which serves as a factor that somehow, perhaps whether reason there, and whether perhaps somehow miraculously drives Allah Akbar to be more said, and whether more stated, and whether in combat moments more shouted words. Whether reason there, and whether reason there. Noticing much of life, what certain forces don't have to even make a decision. They simply control the motivation towards certain decisions. Notice the favor, notice the fetish when there's cheat groups. We're sort of participant, not supposed to be predicting it, but be reacting towards it mostly, and whether much more of. And then it comes off of what the proportion being, and whether they're measuring also a proportion of much more of. And then they will come to sort of the sanction of life itself. And along the way, all of the including 2 nuclear bombs is to serve the greater good. While the perpetrators must, whether the persons did it, must along, whether didn't sort of did it out of decisions, must come to play that role. And there might be factor of making it worse, but probably still within whether it wouldn't unparalleled, unmatchable to the bound. That is boundless. Whether the bounds of the whether withinness, whether withinness of the universe, that is boundless. And that itself, the 2 nuclear bombs will save the greater good, will save, or perhaps I'm an excellent preacher and this is to serve until I dominate the whole globe with my Skynet and my drones and my elite groups of inspired and championed individuals. As much as life is, if one tries to think about bad things, I'll try to plot and murder Putin, for example. Once he matches face to face, he's not going to, in a way, because we all have the oscular eye. This is like a Sauron's pendant and carries a natural force which is to correspond with others. Reason there might be explicit, whether a bit more of a direct and whether more of a medical examination, whether maybe for presentation purposes, whether more of analysis and whether research approach and whether reason there just and whether reason there and whether minor and whether reason there and whether minor mention whether reason there and minor whether and whether reason there and whether minor rather and whether reason there and whether minor rather more of a whether reason there and whether minor rather a investigation mention or whether minor rather a analysis thereof, whether analysis mention thereof, or whether reason there and whether a minor, whether reason there and rather and whether minor rather and whether reason there and whether reason there and whether minor rather, more for analysis mention of. Plotting 2 nuclear bombs was saved from it. It could have been 3 nuclear bombs. It could have been 5 nuclear bombs. It could have gotten into a worse trial, which then chosen one me doesn't come sooner. Whether it comes to the sooner or within the set of whether the appropriate date set, whether within the appropriate date. Most persons, most living beings, not the Nazis, and whether except the Nazis and entities, whether most of the living things. And whether reason there and whether another whether reason there and whether minor instead of whether reason there and whether minor rather. And whether also most living things, whether most living beings, whether most participants, whether most living things work together for the greater good. In order to achieve so, there must be sort of announcement of greater good, whereas if therefore others aren't doing the greater good. Notice everyone's sort of locked into that place, whether that plane, and whether first of, and whether reaching there, and whether before of. And I have this maneuverability. Perhaps that's also what the chosen one sort of indicates to, and whether represents of. Enough with the flowing business. Let's get onto the real course, and whether onto the counter to terrorism agenda. Recently can be considerable as provide providence of improbable comparative much of a distortion or whether a node for anesthetic place out there. As much as sort of doing the right thing, and then usually there is now without contact from modernity push to this jokish toxic and whether jokish sugar terrorism and whether sugar terrorist terror toxic whether they're not whether reason there just whether reason there and whether reason there and whether this terrorism environment and also along with the whether also there's the distortion set whether the cultural level whether there's major contaminations out there and whether there's contaminations there whether reason there and there's contaminations out there. Whether reason there is probable, whether it's also suitable, and whether it's probable to also be of. For that reason, the whether reasons particularly not good or whether unsuitable, for the probable countable, which that's a bit of a minor retardation mentioned of. And whether reason there minor retardation mentioned.